Nero was the fifth and last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, reigning from 54 AD until 68 AD. His full imperial name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but he is more commonly referred to as just Nero, so that's what we'll call him. Nero succeeded his great-uncle Claudius, an efficient, ambitious man who actually turned out to be one of the more successful emperors of the Roman Empire. However, Nero is largely remembered as one of the worst emperors, infamous for the murder of his mother, Agrippina, a great fire in 64 AD that consumed a large portion of Rome, and extravagant projects that led to questionable economic and political decisions. Nero ruled for 13 years, his suicide at age 30 ending the first dynasty of Roman emperors and starting a civil war. His distinct rise to power and contentious reign make him a fascinating figure of ancient history, and the topic of this episode of Who Was. Just to note, a lot of what we know about Nero's rule comes from secondary and tertiary sources. The histories that were written during the time of his rule were pretty opinionated and have since been lost, so accordingly there's some conflicting accounts. For this episode, I'll try to be as fair as possible with historical accuracy. Apologies for any mistakes. Nero was born Lucius Domnatus Ahenobarbus in AD 37, son of Gnaeus Domnatus Ahenobarbus, who was a close relative of the emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and reportedly a dishonest and detestable man. His mother was Agrippina the Younger. She was the sister of Emperor Caligula and great-granddaughter of the first Emperor Augustus. When his father was congratulated by his peers on the birth of his new son, Domnatus reportedly said, "I don't think anything produced by me and Agrippina could possibly be good for the state or the people." Whether or not these words were actually said is questionable, but there is truth in them. Something else that could use some clarity is the Roman naming conventions. Roman nomenclature was based on the tria nomina, or three names: praenomen, nomen, and cognomen. We'll use Julius Caesar's name here for example. Praenomen was a personal name, given to a child by his parents. Men were usually known to their family, friends, and close relatives by this name, and often were named after their father or other male relatives, as a way to preserve the continuity of a family line. Nomen designated a Roman citizen as a member of a gens, or group. That could be a race, a family, or a clan. This goes a bit beyond what we know as a family or a surname, as it may apply to people outside of the traditional family. The nomen was an essential element of the name as it established the person as a Roman citizen, and later could indicate their social status. Women were often referred to only by their nomen, as it did not change with marriage, and it was easy enough to distinguish them from other women of the family. The cognomen was essentially another personal name, which could be adopted throughout a person's life. As time passed in Roman culture, citizens began to tack on more cognomens as a way of identifying themselves, especially as praenomina became less effective. There are only a few dozen praenomina used, and less as time went on. As you can imagine, this all became very complex. But that's all we have to worry about on names. Nero's young life was, in a word, hectic. His mother, Agrippina, was embroiled in a plot that led her brother, the then Emperor Caligula, to banish her and her sister to an island in the Mediterranean. This scheme became known as the Plot of Three Daggers. Caligula had a really strange and intimate relationship with his sisters, and some alleged it as incestuous. He was particularly fond of one sister, Drusilla, who died in AD 38. Following her death, Caligula reportedly went insane and showed no respect or interest for his other siblings. Drusilla's widower, a man called Lepidus, Agrippina, and another sister, Livilla, had plotted to murder Caligula and then make Lepidus the new emperor. The three were found out, Lepidus executed, and the two sisters exiled to the Pontine Islands in the middle of the Mediterranean in AD 39. In the following year, Domnatus died of an edema, and Nero was stripped of his inheritance and sent to live with an aunt. Luckily enough for our boy Nero, the plot of the Three Daggers wasn't the only scheme to murder Caligula, who was killed in AD 41 by the Praetorian Guard, spurred on by the Senate with the hope of reestablishing the Republic. Without the support of the military, though, a new emperor was on the throne, being Claudius. Claudius lifted the exile of Agrippina and her sister, returning Nero to his mother's care. Nero was still only 4 years old at the time, so it's not likely that any of this turmoil left much of an impression on him. In fact, there's not much known about young Nero's early childhood activities. Most of the histories write of Agrippina. Claudius had Nero's inheritance reinstated, and his mother was making moves as well. She married a prominent, wealthy man named Crispus, who soon died in AD 47, and left his estate to his new stepson Nero. In AD 48, the Emperor Claudius had his third wife, Messalina, executed for conspiring with another man to overthrow him, but that set the opportunity for Agrippina to become his fourth wife. Agrippina was ruthless, cunning, always in the right place at the right time. She probably deserves a Who Was episode of her own. She knew that Claudius needed her politically. The emperor felt vulnerable, since he only belonged to one arm of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and was lacking an obvious adult heir, his son Britannicus being only just a child. This led Claudius to marry Agrippina and adopt her son as his own, renaming Lucius Domitius Anabarbus, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, and although it wasn't immediately clear, as his eventual successor. There's some discussion about whether or not Agrippina poisoned Claudius, although what is clear is her maneuvering of pieces around the emperor to ensure that her son, Nero, was the emperor upon his death, and not Britannicus. Nero was favorited by the Praetorian Guard. He was married to Claudius's daughter Octavia in AD 53, and was given preferential treatment in public responsibilities, all while Britannicus was sidelined. When Claudius died suddenly in AD 54, Nero ascended the throne under the new name Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He was 17 years old, the youngest emperor yet. A fun side note, many emperors adopted Caesar as a cognomen, as the name still commanded respect from the people. Nero was initially a pretty popular ruler, a phrase I feel might be used pretty often in these Who Was episodes. He put an end to the harsher practices of the latter part of Claudius's reign. Nero's early rule meant to reestablish the traditional Roman principles. Practices like secret trials were abolished, corrupt freedmen, the people who were once slaves but then released by law, were put down, giving more status to the Roman gentry. He also gave more independence to the Senate. Nero knew where to make the right friends, or should we say, Agrippina knew where to make the right friends. Nero was fond of the arts, and in truth probably left most of the ruling to a few advisors. His former tutor, Seneca, a prefect to the Praetorian Guard, Burrus, and his mother. Most of his own ideas were described as well-meant but incompetent, like abolishing taxes. Most accounts claim that Nero's early reign was domineered by Agrippina. He wore the mantle of a young, reasonable, generous emperor, while Mom worked in the background to put down dissenters. However, this relationship soon changed, with a power struggle developing between mother and son. The late teenage years. This struggle came to a head in AD 59, with Agrippina's murder. There are, as always, conflicting accounts about this event, many of which are pretty fantastical. The basic premise is that Nero became tired of his mother meddling in his personal and public life, and had her murdered. One interesting history has Nero purposefully wrecking a ship with his mother on board, and then sending assassins to murder her as she swam ashore. This event marked a turning point in our emperor's reign. As one classical scholar suggests, Nero lost all sense of right and wrong, and listened to flattery with total credulity. In 62 AD, Nero's advisor Burrus died. His wife, Octavia, was exiled and murdered, and the emperor married a longtime mistress, Poppaea Sabina. He also called for a number of executions of his rivals. Many account this year as the turning point for Nero, in a bad way. He lost favor with the Senate and became more enthralled with his artistic and aesthetic passions, playing the lyre for audiences, competing in athletic games, and in AD 64 marrying a freedman of his, in the first example of open sexual depravity. At the time, it's okay to be gay. It was an odd time, and the Roman Senate and people began to take issue with their ruler. Nero's most infamous piece of history comes in 64 AD, with the Great Fire of Rome. A fire started in the middle of July and ravaged the city for several days, damaging about 3/4 of the city and destroying 3 districts completely. There are a few theories about how the fire started. 1. Nero sent out men to start the fire, either covertly or conspicuously, and watched it spread from his palace while playing the lyre, singing and dancing. 2. The fire was started by Christians, unpopular at the time. Or 3. The fire was simply an accident and Nero wasn't even in the city at the time. In the wake of the fire, large swaths of Rome were open for redevelopment, which Nero took full advantage of. Houses built after the fire were more spaced out, built in brick, and had porches. A new palace complex was constructed called the Domus Aurea, something Nero was already planning before the fire, feeding into the theory that Nero had planned it in the first place. This was a huge palatial complex that was somewhere between 100 and 300 acres large, and it also featured a 100-foot-tall statue of Nero. The lasting legacy of the rebuild after the fire was the immense cost. There was simply no money to rebuild, so taxes were raised and tributes were required from provinces of the empire. For the first time in history, the precious metal purity of the Roman currency was reduced by Nero, meaning a Roman coin that once contained 99.5% silver now only contained 93.5%. This set a trend that would mean economic issues for Rome centuries down the line. If you're interested in that, I really recommend picking up a book Balance by Glenn Hubbard. It gives some really great economic insight onto the collapse of empires, one of which is the Roman. The wake of the fire left the Roman Empire under great strain. There were a number of plots to overthrow or assassinate Nero from 64 to 68. With things in disarray at home, Nero took a year-long trip to Greece, for he revered their culture. In Greece, he competed in games, gave into artistic indulgence, generally decided to goof off. Upon his return back to Rome in AD 68, the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the Roman people had all but made up their minds. A governor in Spain, Galba, had won support of the Praetorian Guard, and the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the people, calling for his execution. Nero fled the city of Rome with intentions of heading east to loyal supporters, but with no friends or guard left in Rome, and the looming call of the Senate to have him executed as a slave, under the whip, he decided to commit suicide. An account of Suetonius has him stabbing himself in the throat with a dagger, exclaiming, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's legacy enjoyed no lasting love from his subjects or the histories. His Domus Aurea was demolished and built over in the years following his suicide. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty to make way for the chaotic Year of the Four Emperors, and his name in modern times is known for debauchery, misrule, and Christian persecution. Perhaps he was too young to rule, or perhaps his mother was too domineering to force to breed a competent ruler. Nero probably would have been better off as an artist or an athlete, but he was the 5th emperor of the Roman Empire, and a fantastic subject of this episode of Who Was. Thanks for watching this episode of Who Was. This channel takes a historical figure every other week and examines their life and times to find out what makes that person worth knowing about. Next episode, we'll ask, who was Madam C.J. Walker? If you enjoyed this episode, please find a way of letting me know. That could be through a like on the video or a comment telling me how it could be better. If you think it's worth it, please subscribe and follow this channel as we delve into more interesting historical figures. Thanks again.